All right, band pick of the week for this week is, she's 26 years old. She's a vocalist and guitar player. Her name's Phoebe Bridges. Has anybody heard of Phoebe Bridges? I don't know what you guys are doing here, but yeah, she's an indie rock, well, sort of more folk type oriented. So you might want to take a listen to her. Her newest album is called Punisher. Anyway, she's a guitarist and lead singer, so you might take a listen to Phoebe. All right, I just wanted to sort of go over where we've been and what sort of summarize what we've been doing in terms of property law. And so we established that, if we talked about what is property, and we talked about a bundle of rights. Okay, so the law is telling you have the right to this, the right to do that. And we talked about, do you have some responsibility? So it's a legal concept about what your rights are. So then we said, well, when people are trading these things around, we then talked about bargaining, right? We said, okay, if you go into Walmart, you don't have to bargain. We take ECON 202, what do you assume? Everybody's a price taker, right? I mean, nothing in ECON 202, people bargaining with one another. You're a consumer, what are you doing? You're looking at what the market price is, and when you were drawing the perfectly competitive firm, they were looking at the market price, and they were setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, but price is marginal revenue, right? But what happens when you have bilateral exchanges? I'm trying to sell my guitar to somebody, or you're buying a used car, or you are buying a company called TikTok, okay? Well, it's going to be a $40 billion or $50 billion deal. How does that bargain happen? How is Microsoft bargaining with an Oracle, and they're all bargaining with TikTok to buy it? So bilateral exchange. And then that led us to talk about the cooperation surplus. And we said, okay, when I buy something from somebody else, what's happened? It's moved from somebody that had a certain value to it to me, and I must have valued it more than they did. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sold it to me, right? And I must have valued it enough that I was willing to pay for it. So if, and we use the example of the guitar, if I valued it at 500 or you valued at 500, it was my guitar at 300, then if it transferred to you, then there was $200 in surplus. And how did we divide it up? We said, well, if the price was 400, then I got 100 of it and you got 100 of it. And so we'd like to have bargaining go on. So we'd like to structure the law so that it improves bargaining. What sort of things that you can talk about why that might happen. And then we talked about why you might form government as the solution to the prisoner's dilemma, right? And we talked about the idea of steal, not steal. When we gave the example of the prisoner's dilemma, we said that, okay, what's the prisoner's dilemma? It's that all the players have a dominant strategy, which is their best strategy no matter what the other player does. But when they both play their dominant strategies, they get less than if they played the cooperative strategy. So how do you solve that problem? Well, you can solve that problem through government, right? You have government and you say, okay, we're going to make a law that says thou shalt not steal. I think we said it was the sixth commandment. Is that what we decided on? So what's the sixth commandment about, right? That could be a solution to the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so you might form government as a mechanism to solve that prisoner's dilemma. And then we said, okay, let's use economics to look at what can we do to look at bargaining costs? Right? We're going to say, okay, we'd like people to cooperate with one another and make this exchange. So what are the problems with doing that? What are the problems with this being unable to bargain? Okay, we used an externality example, right? I mean, you can use but any type of example where you've got bilateral, some sort of bilateral exchange. How can you make it so that that it's easier for that to happen? So we talked about what are some of the bargaining costs that in order to get cooperation, and we said you got search costs, right? I'm looking for, again, 1965 Ford Mustang. How can I make it so that it's easier to find that 1965 Ford Mustang? Okay, so we invent Craigslist, right? Or eBay, okay? But there's got to be all sorts of rules about eBay, okay, right? What happens if, how do we make it so that eBay exists? What is eBay, right? eBay must be a company, but we must have had statutes, we must have laws that set up, say, okay, here's how eBay works, all right? And what it can and can't do. So, we would structure the laws so that you can reduce these search costs. Again, I said that used to have classified ads in newspapers. Okay, but how does that work? Well, do you pay for the classified ad, et cetera, right? So we've got, you under a contract in the sense that I want to put my ad in the Hillsdale Daily News. How does that work, right? Then we talked about the different kinds of bargaining costs, right? So we said these are really transactions. So to transactions to bargaining. So I should have probably put it as transactions costs. But so you got the search costs, and then embedded with that is you have these bargaining costs. And things like BATNA, right? That's where we brought in the idea of best alternative, or your threat value, right? So we'd like to have things that reduce those bargaining costs, and so we talked about the property rights, right? So that I know who's got the property, right? So I know that you own this car. I know that you own this, this house. We assume a right of first possession, so that if I go into Walmart, I'm presuming that they own whatever they got that they're selling to me. And then we looked at enforcement costs. Well, we could say, so you know who owns. So we want to structure the laws to make it so that it's easy to know who owns, right? I mean, all this is about structuring the laws to reduce these transactions costs. And then the third thing we talked about was enforcement costs. And we noted that where you have a short time frame, you go into Market House and you buy a box of cereal, right? It's an instantaneous thing. You exchange your money, they give you the cereal. Okay, but what if it happens over time? That as you buy a house and you put some money down and then you pay over time. But what happens if you stop paying? Okay, and so you need to have some rules about how that's all going to work. So that led us, and again, clear property rights make it so that these transactions costs are less than they otherwise would be. So that's one of the things that you want to make sure that when you're structuring the law, one of the things you can do is have clear property rights. And then we said, well, I got sort of two sort of ways of looking at it. We said there's the normative the normative coast theorem, right? So that what you do is you say, okay, what we ought to do is we ought to reduce the cost to agreement, right? But remember the coast theorem says that if there's zero transactions costs, it doesn't matter to whom I assign the property right? It'll go to the person that values it the most. So that's what our efficient solution is, right? You want the property right to go to the person that values it the most. So a normative coast theorem, what they're talking about is they say, okay, what happens if what you do is you structure the law so that you're going to reduce transactions costs, right? So what do? You focus on reducing transactions costs. So when I'm looking at putting the law together, I'm trying to make laws efficient. I make laws efficient when I reduce this transactions costs of making the bargaining. And again, I think table 4.3 in the book, they give you a summary of what the different transactions costs might be, what things add to transactions costs. But so if you're doing the normative coast, what they call the normative coast theorem, what are you doing? You're focusing on let's structure the law so that we reduce what the costs are of transactions. Then the normative Hobbs theorem, that's the idea that says, okay, transactions costs are going to be high. So what can we do in the law to get over this problem of high transactions costs, right? So if you have high transactions costs, what do? What do? Well, what you have to do then is you have to try to assign the property right. Right? Well, I'm going to say try to get enough information to assign the property right. Because what's going to happen? If transactions costs are high, it's going to stick with whoever gets it. It's going to stick with whoever has the property right. So for example, we use the example of a stop sign on Milnes Road in US 12. Okay? You are not going to use the normative coast theorem. You're not going to be able to figure out a way to reduce the transactions costs enough that people can bargain about who can go through the stop sign. So that would say, okay, let's try to figure out who values the property right the most, and we'll assign the property right to them. So that would be a normative Hobbs situation. If it were people buying houses from one another, then what you might do is say, okay, let's assume that we can reduce those transactions costs so that people can actually buy and sell houses. What do we need to do, right? We need to make it some way that you can reduce the search costs. If you probably haven't bought a house, but the real estate agencies can advertise basically the houses for sale, right? There's a mechanism by which you can get on the website or whatever. The realtors, before they had websites, the realtors would exchange information about, okay, this house for sale, etc. So I didn't have to just go to one real estate agent. They would know what the other real estate agent houses that were out there for sale. So if we do something that tries to reduce those search costs, or again, establish clear property rights so you reduce the bargaining costs, if you can find out a way to, we're going to structure the law to enforce the property rights, then we're going to be dealing with the coast theorem. If the transactions cost, we say, oh, those are going to be too high. We got to figure out who values it the most and assign the property right to them. Yeah.
Is there like a crowding out effect with transaction costs in the normative Hobbs? Like, if we assign the property right because the transaction costs are really high, does that tend to create a situation where there's no incentive to reduce transaction costs, or does it tend to still be the case that those costs are reduced?
Yeah, he was asking if we focus on assigning the property rights, and you would use the Hobbesian method, does that mean we're not going to try to reduce the transactions costs? If you can do both, that would be optimal. They're just, the authors are just saying, when you do this, reduce the transactions costs, we're going to say that's the normative cost. And if you do this, where you're trying to figure out who values the property the most, then we're going to call that the normative Hobbs. You could do both, right? You know, if you can reduce transactions costs, that's fine, because you may not know how high those transactions costs are. But intuitively, there might be situations where it's pretty clear they're not going to be able to bargain, right? Should you be able to put unleaded gas in your car, okay? Probably not, right? You're probably going to say, nah, we think the people that value that right the most are the people that are breathing in breathing in the air, and so we're going to assign the property right to them and say you can't do that, right? Or suppose that you have, again, sulfur dioxide going into the atmosphere. I'm a Detroit Edison or Consumers Power, and I'm producing electric power. And I'm putting sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere when I use coal, okay? And then what happens is it turns into H2SO4 when it mixes with the water, and it becomes sulfuric acid, and it gets in people, get acid rain. I don't know if you heard about acid rain, but that's what that was about, right? So what do? You make them put scrubbers on, or you say, no, we are going to assign the property right to the people who are breathing in the air. And so there are probably instances where it's pretty clear which is the situation. And they're just distinguishing between laws which try to use the information to figure out who owns the property or who values the property the most, focus on assigning the property right to them. Okay? So you could use both, but it's not precluded. If I'm assigning the property right, what's coast say? If I assign it incorrectly and the transactions costs are sufficiently low, what's going to happen? Doesn't matter, right? I can assign the property right to whomever it is. If I also reduce the transactions costs, then even if I get it wrong in terms of assigning to the person that values it the most, it will transfer over. All right. So if you sort of think about it, then it really depends on the amount, the relationship between the transactions costs and the information costs, right? I've got a transactions cost that's going to affect the ability of the property to move about from whomever I assign it to the person that values it the most. And then I got an information cost in the sense that if I'm going to assign the property right, I got to know who values it the most, right? And if information costs are really high, I'm going to tend to look more towards the Coase theorem. If the information costs are low and the transactions costs are high, I'm going to look more towards the Hobbesian solution, okay? All right. So that takes us up to section 5 in the textbook, which is about protecting. This was section 5 in the book, protection of property rights. Right? We said that what's property rights are, you're given a bundle of rights. And how do you protect that? You own that property. There are certain rights that go with it. Again, we talked about maybe you might have some responsibilities that go with it. Can you just own this house and let it fall apart? And of course, what's that? That creates this negative externality in that the value of my house depends on a certain extent on the value of the houses around me. And there's what's the Clint Eastwood movie where he pays what is it?
Gran Torino.
Yeah, Gran Torino. In Gran Torino, the kid is supposed to work for him. Instead of having the kid fix his house up, he has the kid fix the house up that's across the street. Okay? So what was that saying? It says there's a negative externality here. The fact that this house across the street is falling down is affecting my property values. So do you have a responsibility to not let your house fall down, right? What we call those. You know, there might be laws, they could be local, they could be state, that say, okay, you have to maintain your property. Right? The inspector, Alan Beaker, is the guy that works here in the city of Hillsdale. Alan Beaker could come over and say, hey, you know what, you have to fix that. I don't know if you've seen, sometimes you drive by a house that might have a yellow thing on it, sign on it or whatever. So do you have a responsibility? Can you not feed your dog? Right? Maybe if you own that dog, then you have a responsibility to take care of that dog. Okay? So there are rights and responsibilities that go with these things. So two sort of major ways of looking at protection of the property rights is, one is what's called a legal remedy, like someone violates your property rights. Right? So someone violates your property rights. And a legal remedy says you're going to pay compensatory damages. Right? Compensatory damages says, okay, the plaintiff says, hey, you violated my property right. Okay, so you go to court or you call the police or whatever. And what is the damages that the person has to pay you are the compensatory damages. Say, okay, you violate my property rights, what do? You got to compensate me. That's what it's about, right? So the defender has to compensate the plaintiff if the court rules in favor of the plaintiff. The other major category of dealing with this is equitable remedy. And what equitable remedy is about is that the court rules that the defendant has to perform or not perform. Right? So And what we mean by that is you can see that it says, okay, yeah, an example. Okay, you have to fulfill the contract. Okay, you guys have made a contract. You're a rock and roll band, and you're supposed to play at this venue. You have to fulfill that contract. Or let's say you are you own the venue, okay, and you've entered into a contract to pay my band $5 million to show up and play at this major venue. Then let's say there was a illness that comes out, and maybe it's coronavirus, and nobody's going to show up at the venue, right? Do I still have to fulfill the contract if I'm the owner of the venue, right? Does the owner of the venue have to fulfill the contract? Well, if the court rules that they do, then that would be an equitable remedy. It says you have to perform, you have to fulfill the contract. Or you could look at when we mean by not perform, you're trespassing on my property, okay? The equitable remedy would say, you can't, you not perform, you can't trespass on my property. So that's what's called an injunction. So you probably heard of an injunction, but an injunction is where the court either says you have to do this, or you have to perform, you have to fulfill this contract, or you have to stop doing what we tell you tell you that you have to stop doing. Now you could combine both, right? You could say, okay, you gotta compensate me for trespassing on my property, and you can't do it anymore, right? So the court could say, you got to compensate for what you did in the past. Notice that compensation tends to be backward looking, right? So just sort of think about that. Compensation, it says you did something. You did something, and now you got to compensate the other person for it. An injunction would say, hey, you can't do that, right? Or you have to do this, okay? Yes, yeah.
So just to be clear, legal is the one where you pay, or equitable?
Is what now?
The one where you pay compensation, is that legal or equitable?
Well, if you have to pay compensation, that is the legal. Excuse me. That's the legal remedy. Is I got to pay compensation. Okay, payment. It's just they just classify them as, because if you were going to law school or whatever, they're going to call it legal remedy or equitable remedy. But basically, there's two things you can do. You can make people pay for the damages that they did, or you can make them do the action that has agreed to. You can fulfill you have to fulfill a contract, or you can't, you can't keep trespassing on my property or whatever. But Josiah?
I had the same question. I think on Friday you had it flipped when you said it.
Oh, did I?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry. So the legal remedy is the payment of compensatory damages, and the equitable remedy is where you pay them, or you have them perform the act or not. So that's an injunction. All right. So again, you could combine them. The damages are called the liability rule. And you've heard people say you're liable for the damages, right? So damages are simply a liability rule, and the equitable is a property rule, right? If you sort of think about it, if this is a property right, if you sort of think about it, right? Where you can have an injunction it's essentially a property right, okay? It essentially says, hey, I could basically sell you the right to have an injunction. So if I could say, hey, I'm gonna get an injunction against you trespassing on my property, but what's going on is, let's say there's I got my house here, and there's a lake here, and you want to get from this main road over to the lake because you want to put a boat on here, okay? I could preclude you from, if I've got the property right, I can get an injunction, say, hey, you can't cross here. But what you could do is you could say, hey, I'll give you $300 a month if you let me cross your property, okay? So if it is an injunction, it's really like a property right. and I could sell it to you, okay? And so just sort of when we were talking about when do you focus on the legal remedy and when you focus on the equitable remedy, it's mainly about whether you want to deal with, can you move this property right from one person to another, and the mechanism by which you might do that. So notice that, again, as we were talking about when we were talking about the Coase theorem and saying that the Coase theorem, it doesn't matter to whom I assign the property rights, but from an efficiency standpoint, but it does from an income distribution standpoint. Clearly, I'd like to have the property right? Because then I could sell it to you, and I don't have to buy it from you. So I'd like to have the property right given to me to start with. Similarly here, that how you assign the property right can affect the BATNA, right? Can affect the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So it can affect, right, the BATNA of the owner, like who you've assigned the right to. Right? So I've assigned a property right to somebody, and so the equitable rule, which is an injunction, is really a property right that I can then sell to you. You say, hey, I want to be able to use this little driveway or whatever to get to the lake. Then I can I can say, okay, fine, you can do that. Give me $300 a month or whatever. Okay. Let's give an example. Let's say you have the EPA is going to rule on CO2 emissions. Okay, we're going to talk about CO2 emissions. Is that how you spell emissions? Is that, yeah, one M, two S, is that right? Okay. So the EPA is going to rule on carbon dioxide emissions. And maybe we say, okay, it causes global warming or something like that, right? There might be something that we say, okay, there's some externality. So does the company that's producing, let's say, Detroit Edison or whatever, do they have the right to put carbon dioxide out there? We already decided, that they don't have the right to put sulfur dioxide out there. The actual law has said that. But are we going to do something that says, oh, you have to limit what your carbon dioxide is going out there? You don't have the right to stick carbon dioxide out there. So what we could do is we could say the polluter has the right, right? And well, let's say DTE is the electricity provider, and we'll call it pollution, right? So we could say that the polluter has the right to emit, right? That is DTE has the right to emit CO2, okay? Or we could say the citizen has the right to damages, that is, if we say, okay, DTE, if you put carbon dioxide out there, citizens have the right to damages, or the citizen has the right and can enjoin, that is, use the injunction to keep DTE from polluting. Right? So we can assign, really what we're doing is say we're going to assign the property right to either the citizen, or we're going to assign the property right to DTE, and then once we've assigned that right, how are we going to deal with what happens when DTE violates that right, right? What if you, the citizen, have the right and DTE violates it? If DTE violates it, you got basically the two options, right? Either DTE's got to pay compensation to you, or you have the ability to enjoin DTE from sending out the pollution. Now, notice that under damages, it's somewhat like a forced sale in the following sense. A forced sale in the sense that DTE can choose to omit and pay compensation. Right? So under damages, DTE can essentially buy the right and you don't get to say no, right? What happens is that whatever the court sets as the damages, okay, then DTE can choose to buy that right away from you by doing what? By paying the damages. So that's an interesting way to sort of look at how damages work, in that they allow a transaction to happen on the one side. That is, you're going to be paid the compensation. Now, if we get the compensation right, you sort of think about it, if you get the compensation right, if they were to fully compensate you and got it exactly right, then you'd be indifferent to whether they caused the damage and they paid you, or they didn't cause the damage at all. Okay, so if you had good information about compensation, then that might be something that you'd want to do, because it sort of lubricates the bargaining in the following sense that I can choose, if I'm DTE, if I'm looking at this and I go, okay, I got to pay $100 in compensation, but it's worth $200 to me so I don't have to put the scrubber on or something, then what's going to happen? I'm going to choose to compensate, okay? So that's an interesting sort of way to think about that. Now, when you're choosing whether to have to use damages or an injunction, and when you're choosing to do that, you got to think about what the costs are, the relative costs between transactions and information, right? So let's just make a comment here. If transactions costs are high, what does that tell you? It tells you that, okay, the property right's going to probably stick with the person that gets it, right? So if I got high transactions costs, the property right will likely stick with whomever it's assigned to. Notice that I said whomever instead of whoever, right? So I get a little better grade in my English. But the point is that if there's high transactions costs and I'm going to give it to somebody, it's going to stick there. So it matters to whom that I might give it to. So in a sense, it's more likely that the efficient remedy is going to be damages. Okay, it's more likely that the efficient remedy is damages unless you know who values it the most. That is, who values the property right the most. That's what I mean by it. Who values the property right the most. Because if what I do is I don't know who values it the most, I'm going to stick it, just give it to somebody, and it's going to stick there. Okay? If I allow for damages, at least if the value to the person that if I set the damages up correctly, if I knew exactly the compensation to give, then what would happen? If I knew exactly the compensation, then if I were DTE, I could choose to compensate you if the value to me was bigger than the value to you, right? The value to you is going to be the compensation. I'll just go ahead and do it, and we don't have to have a transaction. I mean, because I can choose to just pay those damages. So that's what they mean by an injunction being a forced sale, in the sense that is the party that's going to have to pay the damages can go ahead and make that transaction, and we don't have to worry about transaction costs, right? It can just automatically happen. Again, if damages are perfectly efficient, right? If damages perfectly compensate, right? So if damages perfectly compensate, then what will happen is the plaintiff is going to be indifferent, right? So the plaintiff is indifferent. Right? Between compensation or injunction. If DTE is going to cost me $300 in damages from putting out the carbon dioxide, and I'm going to get compensated that $300 if they actually do it, then what do I care, right? I can either have them not send out the CO2, or I can have them send out the CO2 and I get my $300 back, and if I'm perfectly compensated, then it doesn't matter. But it allows DTE to make that decision about whether they're going to go ahead and do it or not. So essentially, there doesn't have to be a bargain, right? So there's not a need to bargain. I can overcome the transactions cost of bargaining. There's no need to bargain, right? Because DTE can choose to pay me, and they then, in a sense, have obtained that property right. So if transactions costs are high, then, well, first of all, if there's no transactions costs, what are you going to do? If there's no transactions costs, what are you going to choose? Injunction or compensation? No transactions costs. Everybody's going to volunteer. If I got no transactions costs, then what's going to happen is the property right is going to what? It's going to move to the person who values it the most, because they're going to be able to transact. So what did we say injunction was, right? An injunction was the property right. I can preclude DTE from sending stuff out into the CO2 out into the atmosphere. So if there's zero transactions costs, what would you choose? Yeah, injunction, right? If there's zero transactions costs, then you're going to choose injunction, right? Because why? Because the court doesn't have to figure out what the damages might be, right? The court doesn't have to. if there's no transactions cost, it's this Coasian, so the normative cos, right? That's what I'm talking about, the normative cos. If there's no transactions cost, then I can give an injunction which says you have the right to keep me from doing it or not, right? But I could sell you that right, right? And so with zero transactions costs, if I have no transactions costs, then I can use an injunction. So what is that? That assigns the property right. And then with no transactions costs, then the parties can trade. So an injunction is the equivalent of assigning the property right. Okay? When we sort of went back to when we were first talking about the Coase theorem, what did it say? It says that somebody's going to get the right, right? So there's some sort of externality or whatever. My use of the property is affecting your use of the property. What can I do? I could, if I assign that property right, it's efficient to assign it to either party. So if you sort of think about it, then the transaction cost, if you have no transactions costs, I don't need to know the relative value. I don't need to know what the compensation might be. I don't need, it solves this information cost problem. How can the government know who values it the most, right? So in the case of zero transactions costs, what you do is when you choose an injunction, you give clear property right, okay? So what's the injunction about? An injunction gives a clear property right. And then I can choose to buy that property right from you if I value it more. If you value it more than I do, what will happen? It will stick with you, right? It's not going to move. So no transactions costs, then you're going to choose an injunction because I've now defined a clear property right and the parties can bargain. Right? So the parties have bargained. All right, what we're going to do for next time is we're going to notice that if you have high transactions costs, if you think about it, if you have high transactions costs and you choose the injunction, you got to know who values it more, right? If you choose compensation, then what do you got to know? You got to know how much one party values it, right? I need to know the absolute value to one of the parties so that I can compensate them in the amount that would make it so that they were indifferent between either they have the property right or they don't, and you have the right, and you just when you think about it, really, this issue of damages versus an injunction really depends on what the transactions costs and what the information costs are. Again, we'll talk more about that on Friday. It's Friday. On Wednesday, we should pretty well finish chapter 4. So you might want to look into chapter 5. Again, I added a couple more sample questions, but for the exam, make sure that you've looked through sample questions. You're probably, some of those questions are going to be harder than you'd be able to do in 10 minutes in a midterm. But if you understand them, you should be able to do a subset of that question or something like that. So work your way through those. If you have any, questions on those questions in terms of, hey, I couldn't figure this one out, go ahead and bring it up in class. All right? Because if you can't get it, somebody else probably isn't getting it. All right? Okay. So see you on Wednesday.